the service, and in the course of the service, I'm introduced to a black woman there who's become very close to Lionel and Sherry. Her name is Teresa Edwards. She's the sister of one of the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer. And she had brought with her one of her sisters, another sister of the victim. Only she had not told the sister what they were coming to. They came from Milwaukee, came to Madison, they came into our church building, and now she finds out she's at the memorial service of the man who killed her brother. Can you imagine the emotions she went through? It was a small crowd, and as there's a small group of people that sat up here in the front, and the sister sat way back in the back pew all by herself. While we had the service, you could hear her silently weep. And my heart went out to her. I felt her sister had done her a terrible disservice, not telling her what was going on. And yet at the same time, we had to progress because that's what we were there for. So we had songs, and I got up to speak a little bit about Jeff's conversion and how what influence Jeff had made on my life, and alluded to a story that I had read recently in a Max Lucado book called 6 Hours One Friday, where Max Lucado tells the story of a teacher, a Bible class teacher in a church, who's got a small child there in her class. And the child never ever speaks. And the teacher began to wonder, what kind of family life did this girl come from where she never ever speaks? It was a strange sort of thing. And then one day she was telling the story about heaven and trying to describe heaven as best as she could use to describe heaven, usually borrowing from the metaphors in the book of Revelation, as we sometimes think that's describing heaven and so forth, golden streets and trees and fruit and all this sort of stuff that's a part of the whole thing. And she noticed that the little girl was mesmerized by what she was talking about. And she was surprised that the girl was paying so much attention. And at the end of her little lesson that she gave, the little girl held her hand up to speak. And this was a big surprise to her because it's the first time the girl has ever spoken at all. And so she calls upon the girl and says, "Yes, Barbara, what would you like to ask?" And she said, her question was a question that haunted her. She said, "Is heaven for little girls like me?" And after I told the story, I said, Jeff's story is a lot like that. Well, instead of being a little girl, he's a little boy. And he's standing on the outside of the circle looking in. He sees all these people singing praises to God. He sees all these people having a relationship one with another. And he's outside. And it's like the young man sitting outside and he hears the stories. And he yearns to be part of it, but he's afraid he's not allowed to come in. And for some people, they're quite angry about the fact that he dared to ask the question, "Is heaven for little boys like me?" And my answer was, "Yes, Jeff, heaven is exactly for little boys like you." Then I asked if there's anyone in the audience who want to speak anything. And so Lionel got up and he spent some time talking about Jeff and how Jeff was his son and how he had spent years with him and worked with him. And the biggest thing to him that he had discovered was that he thought that the best way to handle his problems was to stay away from church. But he had learned the hard way that was a big mistake. That being in church and having church as a part of your life was a major mistake that he had made, and that he had learned to come back to church and let church be a part of what his life is all about, because it helped him to rebuild his life and construct his life. And then he talked quite a bit about how he just learned last night that he had something to do with Jeff's faith, and that was such a big shock to him. And he felt so surprised, and he was very honored that Jeff had said that about him. He made reference to Teresa, who was sitting there, and spoke to her that we're here to talk about Jeff, but we don't want to ignore the fact that you suffer great pain too, and that Jeff instilled those great pains on you. And we're not trying to diminish the heinousness of what Jeff did, but we are here to remember Jeff and to remember and recall that Jeff not only did the things he did, but died as a Christian. He died with faith. He truly believed in God. And then he sat down. And then his brother David got up to speak. And his brother David spoke about his relationship with Lionel. Talked about how Lionel had taught him to play tennis. Talked about the hours they spent together, and never once said a word about Jeff. You wouldn't know they were brothers from what he said. He had so distanced himself from his brother that you almost didn't know, not only by name, that they were not related, but there was no emotional attachment at all. There was not mention at all of his brother. All he talked about was his relationship with his father. And then he sat down. He brought a friend, and the friend got up and had something to say about death and life, and and I kind of felt like, well, I'm the one running the funeral, the memorial, not you. But let's not deal with that. So you get done. So he got done. Then I got up and I sort of summarized everything by talking again about Jeff's faith, and that Jeff really tried to serve God as best he possibly can, and that we're here to remember that part of Jeff. We're not here to remember the criminal. We're here to remember the part that had turned to God. And all of us can identify with that sense of faith and the sense that he had as he died. And it's hard for me to remember all the words that we spoke, but that's pretty much the gist of it all. Then ended the service. And at the end of the service, as we got to the end there, I met the sister with the tears running down her face. And she turned to me and she said, I was so angry at my sister when I found out what I was here for. But after hearing what you have to say about Jeff, I now realize he did believe in God. And I think I'm able to forgive him now for what he did to my brother. And I learned something from that. A lot of times the story of Jeffrey Dahmer hits people the wrong way because they really haven't invested much into what the story's all about. They just start with the headlines and that's all the further they go. They don't really invest very much into what the story's all about at all. And so Jeff received a memorial service. Now Jeff had requested there be no funeral. And I realize it's a little bit legalistic. They had a memorial service, not a funeral service, because we didn't have the body. The body at this point in time was still frozen. There was dispute between mother and father about the body. Mother had insisted that the brain of Jeffrey Dahmer be removed, and so they had removed the brain. She wanted the brain to be studied to determine whether or not Jeff's brain was abnormal, whether or not Jeff had done the things he'd done because he couldn't help it, because his brain had done that to him. And so later on then, the body itself was cremated, which was Jeff's wishes, and there was a bitter fight between mother and father as to how much or what percentage of the ashes each would receive. And that was all run out in the papers, and that's a terrible shame to see that. It's amazing the kind of bitterness that existed between husband and wife years after the divorce. But they fought so bitterly over that. And then about a year later, the brain of Jeffrey Dahmer was cremated after they determined that there was nothing unusual about the brain. And they couldn't determine if the brain was abnormal or not. It looked just like a normal brain as far as they could tell. And that was all as far that they could go with their science. And so the brain then was cremated. And again they fought over the ashes of the brain. And I remember feeling a certain amount of embarrassment for the families. It was so pointless to be fighting like this over something like that. So pointless. And then, of course, there's the reactions people have to the Jeffrey Dahmer story that you still hear today as well. I remember the day Jeffrey died, watching David Letterman that night. And David Letterman comes out after he's introduced and so forth, and the first thing he does, he looks at his watch and says, well, Jeffrey Dahmer ought to be arriving in hell just about now. And everyone erupts in applause. Lionel writes this in his book regarding some of the things that were said about Jeff's murder. Some of the reactions of Jeff's murders were predictable. Congressman Traficant of Ohio ranted to his colleagues something to the effect that we should let all of them just kill each other off. The Chicago WLS AM radio talk show host proclaimed the day as a celebration and said, I'm sure if there is a hell, there's a place of special honor there for Jeffrey Dahmer now. A family member of one of Jeff's victims appeared on a national TV talk show proposing that Jeff's murderer should receive a medal. Reports out of Milwaukee had some people considering Jeff's murder to be poetic justice. Lots of negative reactions to the death of Jeffrey Dahmer. And over the years, I've run into some of that myself, not so much personally, but usually secondhand. Someone asked me last night, have you received any negative reaction? And the answer was no. I've discovered that people are generally cowards when it comes to a face-to-face confrontation. So to my face, what a wonderful thing you've done, what a marvelous thing you've done, and then when I'm not supposed to be listening, what a terrible thing it was to baptize Jeffrey Dahmer or to have anything to do with that. No one would ever believe that he could even be saved or go to heaven at all. And it really comes down to an inability on their part to believe, to understand, to comprehend what salvation is really all about. A passage I want to spend some time with tomorrow morning, but I'll allude to it now, is this passage where Paul summarizes all of Christianity in these words. That it really comes down to this one trustworthy saying, that Christ came to die for sinners, of which Paul claimed to be the worst. It's really all about Jesus dying for sinners. And Jeffrey Dahmer's story is the story of a sinner who came to God. I got several phone calls from people all across the nation and around the world. Most of them thanking me for baptizing Jeffrey Dahmer and telling me what a wonderful thing I'd done. Occasionally I'd get into a call from someone who had a different understanding of baptism. Why did he even need to be baptized? And one tried to accuse me of believing in water regeneration, and that the baptism was invalid because Jeff didn't have a belief in the right sort of baptism. And I said, look, we've got differences here, and we're not going to resolve these differences over the phone. Can't you just rejoice that the sinners come to God? And he said, no, I can't, because they didn't come to God. And so you get this kind of silly debate nonsense going on. But beyond that, most of the others, it didn't matter whether you're talking to Catholics or Lutherans or Presbyterians or Pentecostals, almost every branch of Christendom who contacted me told me what a wonderful thing it was that I responded to Jeffrey Dahmer's request for baptism. And so personally, I've never received any negative comments at all. But I know I've heard others behind my back have said terrible, terrible things, some of them making terrible jokes and so forth. People have a hard time understanding it. And I think they have a hard time understanding it because they just don't want to focus on my part of the story. I was interviewed by A&E when they did a biography of Jeffrey Dahmer, and every now and then someone will tell me they saw me on television the other day. And I know that's usually what they're talking about, because they'll do the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, and then at the end they'll have a picture of me in the congregation walking among the pews and so forth and interviewing me. Of course, my part of the interview lasted originally about an hour and a half, of which about 20 seconds appears in the film, But people who know me will say, hey, I saw you! And sometimes I'll drop money off a bank, and the bank will say, oh, I saw you on TV! And I know exactly what they're talking about. A few years later, then Court TV also did a story about the covered the Jeffrey Dahmer story, and they called me up about doing it, but at the time I was working in camp, and I said, well, I won't be able to be there because I'll be in Black River Falls. I said, fine, we'll come to you. So they came to me during a camp session and interviewed me. There's children running in the background and all kinds of noise like you have at camp, and I'm talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. So it's kind of funny how those things have sort of happened as well. I got invited to a public broadcasting network or station up in Eau Claire called COWS, C-O-W-S, Christians of Wisconsin is what it stands for. And the guy interviewed me about Jeffrey Dahmer, and of course this was so unusual. I'd never heard of Red Green prior to that, and the first question came on the as it was, have you ever seen Red Green? No, I didn't. Well, this sure looks a lot like Red Green. So after that, I started watching Red Green, and sure enough, it sure looked an awful lot like Red Green. It was amazing how much like that it was. It was very unorganized and very strange and unusual. And I was simply trying to tell the story as best I could. And the guy there had never heard of Red Green, but he acted so much like the character Red Green. It was just humorous. But there's that and so forth. And so I've had some experiences, good and bad. Sometimes been called upon to give speeches here and there. I've spoken at the National Jail and Prison Workshop twice, anyway, on the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. No, I guess it's 3 times I spoke there. Once in Michigan, once in Memphis, Tennessee, and the last time was in Searcy, Arkansas, which is where I spoke about that. And people enjoy hearing the story quite a bit, and they often come up to me and talk about how important it meant and what it means to them to hear the story and how moving it is. It's a story that does move you. It carries a great deal of strong Christian reaction on the part of people who hear the story, because it helps them to come to terms with the fact that, yes, a sinner came to God, but like him, I too am a sinner. All my crimes may not have been as heinous as his crimes. My thoughts may not have been as evil as his thoughts were. But I'm just as much in need of coming to God as he is. There's a woman I'm dealing with in Madison right now who's going through a very difficult time in her marriage. She's been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Her husband has a bipolar disorder. And some of the things he's done under the influence of his bipolar disorder has done damage to their finances. And he was diagnosed after he'd done the damage, and so they're in the process of coming out of the damage, but she has a hard time forgiving him because of what he did while he was sick. He's under medication now, been under medication for a year, but she still has a hard time forgiving him. And along the way, then she became interested in another man and has flirted with this other man. She took care of a quadriplegic. She was convinced that she fell in love with this quadriplegic man. And so I'm trying to explain to her, look, you've got MS. In a few years or months, you're going to be in the same position as this quadriplegic. You can't invest your life in this person who can't help you. It doesn't make any sense. You have a husband now who's repented. He's there for you. He's going to help you. Well, most of her problem came down to her sense of guilt. She had fallen for this other man that wasn't her husband. And how can God forgive me? So I was talking to her about the prodigal son story, which I think relates to the Jeffrey Dahmer story. You're a child of God, but you've gone away. You've turned your back on God. And you've done some things that make you feel, according to your own commentary, undeserving of being his child. Go back and read what the son says to himself before he comes back. I need to say to my father, I don't deserve to be your son. I don't deserve to be your son because I've taken the inheritance and I've blown the inheritance. I've said by taking the inheritance, I wish you were dead, old man. I've insulted my father in ways that I cannot repent of. And now I've seen the foolishness of my ways, and I begun to realize that in my father's house, I'd be paid better than I am here. I want to come back and just be a servant to my father. And so I come back to my father, and my father sees me coming, and my father does something uncharacteristic. He runs to me. And I barely begin to start my little commentary about myself. Father, I don't deserve to be your son. For he interrupts and says, bring the ring, bring the robe, bring the shoes. Let's restore my son to his status. I was telling this woman just last Sunday, all you need to do is come home. And he will restore you to your status. You have nothing to be ashamed of when you're in the embrace of God. You are his beloved child in whom he is well pleased. He is pleased to have you as a child. All you've got to do is come home. A lot of people have an understanding, a difficult understanding of Jeffrey Dahmer. How can he be accepted the same way I'm accepted? A few years later, I was going to the Veterans Hospital to visit a man who had been at the Wapaka congregation and had done a great deal toward helping them understand the concept of grace. He would eventually die of his cancer. But he talked to me about how when he was going to school, he was going to a big brotherhood school down in, I think it's Alabama. There's a big school, and they've changed their name recently, but there used to be some kind of a Bible institution sort of thing. About how when the story first broke, he was a student down there, and he heard one of his professors say loudly in the hallway, well, if Jeffrey Dahmer's going to heaven, I don't want to go there. And he shook his head. As a student, he could see the silliness of that. Here's a professor who supposedly knows better, making these grandiose, idiotic statements. He just hasn't thought through what he's saying. Heaven is not for the good. Heaven is not for the righteous. Oh, we hope you're good. We hope you're righteous. That's an important part of your character. But heaven is for those who believe. That's what heaven's really all about. Is heaven for little boys like me? Jeff dared to ask.